Good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first panel of our conference on migration, past, present, and future. My name is Vincent Rougeau, and I'm the Dean of the Law School here at Boston College. And I'll be the moderator and respondent for today's panel on forced migration. And I'll begin by just introducing our two panelists, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we'll proceed this morning. To my immediate left is Professor Karen Mussallo. She's been with the University of California, Hastings since 1997, following years of teaching and lawyering in the nonprofit world. She's written numerous articles on refugee law issues with a focus on gender asylum, as well as religious persecution and conscientious objection as bases for refugee status. Professor Mussallo has contributed to the evolving jurisprudence of asylum law not only through her scholarship, but through her litigation of landmark cases. Her work examines the linkage between human rights violations and migration, with a focus on the phenomenon of femicides in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and its relation to requests for refugee protection from women from these countries. She directs the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, which is internationally known for its cutting-edge research and legal advocacy, and for its program of expert consultation to attorneys around the world. To her left is Father Mark Raper, a priest of the Society of Jesus, who has served as the president of the Jesuit Conference of Asia Pacific since 2008. Father Raper also served as provincial of the Jesuits in Australia from 2002 to 2008. In July 2006, he was elected president of Catholic Religious Australia. Father Raper spent 20 years in the service of refugees. First, as regional director of the Jesuit Refugee Service for Asia Pacific, based in Bangkok, Thailand, and then, for more than 10 years, during the 1990s, as the international director of Jesuit Refugee Service in Rome. In 2001, he held a visiting chair at the Center for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University. So please welcome our two panelists. So our discussion this morning will follow this pattern. Each of our panelists will give a presentation of about 20 minutes or so, and I'll follow their presentation with a brief response, and then we'll get to a conversation with them both, with all of us, that will, I hope, be very interesting and very stimulating. We'll open it up. We have plenty of time today. I'll try to keep an eye on it, but I think we'll be able to have a pretty relaxed and comfortable discussion. So I hope you'll look forward to that opportunity to hear this wisdom and also draw from it in the question and answer period. So let me begin by welcoming Professor Mussallo.
Thank you Thank you very much for such a generous introduction. I apologize in advance for my raspy voice coming from the West Coast, and maybe the weather is a little bit affecting me. Anyway, I thank you for inviting me, and it's quite a pleasure to be here and to be the first speaker. First thing in the morning, I'm going to try to be on my feet and keep everybody awake. What I want to focus on, or what I've been asked to focus on, is really the evolution of the refugee definition. And I want to address that topic by looking or arguing that the refugee definition needs to evolve consistent with the evolution of our understanding of human rights norms. The international refugee definition, as many of you know, had its origins in the World War II period, and it was the response of the international community coming together and recognizing its failure to protect those fleeing the Holocaust. And maybe the iconic image of that failure was when the vessel, the St. Louis, which was carrying Jews fleeing the Holocaust, had been promised the right to disembark in Cuba, was then refused, and desperately pleaded for the right to disembark in the United States, and they were refused, and were sent back to Europe, where many of the individuals on the St. Louis perished. And so that example, in a way, was a call to conscience, or at least I hope it was taken that way, for the nations of the world to come together and to draft a document that would commit the international community to protect those fleeing persecution. And the 1951 Refugee Convention came out of that drafting conference, and it was really an instrument, an international instrument, that addressed the problem that had already occurred. It was backward-looking in the sense that explicitly it limited its coverage to events that had occurred prior to 1951, and it limited it allowed countries to limit their responsibility to applying it to events occurring in Europe. So it really looked at the World War II failure and addressed that. There was, I think, the recognition that the need to protect people fleeing persecution didn't end with World War II, that there was a need to create an instrument that would be forward-looking. And out of that came the 1967 Refugee Protocol, which is identical to the 51 Convention, with the exception that it removes those time and place restrictions of events occurring prior to 1951 and allowing countries to limit their coverage to Europe. And in the convention and the protocol, a refugee is defined as an individual with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. This is really the widely recognized refugee definition. More than 147 countries have ratified one or both of the convention and the protocol. The definition that I just read you really reflects the time period of both sort of the World War II experience and the Cold War by linking the persecution to these 5 grounds, which really were an expression of civil and political rights, with sort of the paradigmatic refugee being someone who was persecuted for their religion or as a political dissident. It comes out of the Cold War, and what kinds of violations of rights are really privileged, where the violation of civil and political rights are privileged, but the violation of economic and social rights are not so privileged. And so, since the time that definition came into being, the world has really changed from that vision of post-World War II Cold War period. And there have been steady developments in the human rights field which recognize the legitimacy of other claims of rights by other populations. So we have, under the banner of women's rights or human rights, the recognition of the protection of women's rights, even if the violation of those rights occur in what we call the so-called private sphere as opposed to the public sphere, or the recognition of the rights of children with the Convention on the Rights of Children, or the growing recognition of the rights of LGBT individuals. And so really the question becomes, or maybe the argument becomes, does a refugee definition develop and expand to recognize that these individuals, these types of claims have legitimacy? And I think the application of the refugee definition, or the controversy over it, in the case of women, really just shows how deeply controversial this question that I've raised is. So, I may say, should the violations of the rights of these populations be protected? And some people might nod their heads and say, well, of course. But it's a deeply controversial issue. Let's look at the example of women and look at the many, many ways in which women's rights are violated. If we think about some of the practices that we read about, acid burnings, honor killings, sexual slavery, the gender apartheid which existed under the Taliban in Afghanistan, domestic violence. There are a multitude of ways in which women's rights are violated. But their protection there have been a number of sort of conceptual barriers to the argument that they fit within the refugee definition. One is this concept or this belief, mistaken, that individuals deserving of refugee protection are individuals whose rights are violated by governments, and not a recognition that that definition also extends to individuals whose rights are violated by private parties, by non-state actors, where the government does not protect. And so in the cases of women, you often have not the government directly being the persecutor, violating the rights, carrying out the acid burning or the brutal domestic violence, but you have it happening in a situation where the government doesn't protect. So that was one of the conceptual barriers, is this non-state actor, but really on a fair definition of the refugee, fair application of the refugee definition, that doesn't hold. That's not a reason. Another sort of basis for the failure of protection has been that if you think of those 5 grounds, the race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group, gender is not one of those grounds. So as the barriers to protection became apparent, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the international body to whom it's entrusted to provide guidance to those states that have ratified the convention and the protocol, the UNHCR began to give guidance as to how the definition should be applied in the cases of women, and to suggest that these barriers that adjudicators might think existed really didn't bar protection, that there was a way to look at the refugee definition, so for instance that non-state actors can be persecutors, and also that of those 5 grounds, that ground particular social group could be interpreted to apply to groups that are defined in part or in whole by gender. And so the UNHCR, starting in the 1980s, began to give this guidance to state parties to the convention and the protocol. And one of the things that UNHCR did in, I believe, the early 1990s was to suggest to countries, to state parties, that they could issue guidance to their adjudicators, that this is an area of a lot of controversy, and that countries, governments should take the lead in guiding their adjudicators on this complicated area. And Canada was the first to do so, and the US, I'm proud to say, was the second to follow, with some very good guidelines that were issued in 1995 that were directed to sort of the first tier of adjudicators, asylum officers, and product of a lot of governmental NGO collaboration, good guidance. And that same year, this is where the irony maybe surfaces, that same year that the US issued these very good guidelines on called gender considerations, and a young woman by the name of Fozia Kasinja, who was from Togo, who was fleeing both a forced marriage, being sold into a marriage to a man 3 times her age, to be his 4th wife, and to undergo female genital cutting, which she had resisted and her family had helped protect her from. She arrived in the US seeking asylum on the basis of her fear. And she was put in detention, and detention's another issue that if I had more time I would go into. She was put in detention where she remained almost a year and a half. And when she went in front of an immigration judge with this claim that she deserved asylum because she was fleeing female genital cutting, she was denied by an immigration judge. So the disconnect, in a way, and again, there's more subtleties and nuances, and if this were a law school class, we would talk about those subtleties and nuances, but the disconnect between those gender considerations of 1995 and the denial by an immigration judge of the claim really highlights the sort of the depth of the controversy, or the depth of the sort of inability to see how these claims could fit. Her case was appealed to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the appellate tribunal with nationwide jurisdiction. And a national campaign was really mounted on her behalf. And probably full disclosure, I was her attorney at the time, and with a team of law students and other colleagues. And it was a lot of really mobilization of people, human rights activists, women's rights activists, who sort of raised the question of why would we deny asylum to this woman and send her back to this fate? And ultimately, she was granted asylum in 1996 in a decision that was a landmark decision that recognized, really, it kind of had raised that issue, raised that question: can claims of persecution by women that are committed by non-state actors, be a basis? And in that decision, the Board of Immigration Appeals, in an almost unanimous decision, granted her protection and said yes and used the social group ground. And many of us who were watching this issue thought, well, now this point has been made. Lawyers like precedent. Here's this precedent. The door has been opened, and more women can walk through. But again, another irony here is that 3 years later, a woman named Rodi Alvarado, who was a Guatemalan woman fleeing very brutal battering at the hands of her husband, in a situation where I like to say the home had become a torture chamber, because if you read the facts of what her husband actually did to her over 10 years of marriage, and she went to the police, she went to the courts, and in Guatemala there was absolutely no recourse. And I could give you a current statistic that would kind of demonstrate why. In Guatemala, they have an epidemic of gender-motivated killings of women, referred to as femicides, and the impunity rate is around 99%. So for every 100 women killed, maybe one person is prosecuted and actually punished. So you could see why the police and the courts don't respond. But the irony was, when Rodi Alvarado came and applied for asylum, she was first granted by an immigration judge who cited the Kasinga decision, and then her case went on appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals, and the BIA, which was the same body who had granted asylum to Fauzia Kasinga, reversed the grant of asylum to Rodi Alvarado, distinguishing it in ways that attempted to justify the different decision. And, again, there's a lot of nuances. We could have a difference of opinion about the legal analysis, but I really am going a little bit for big picture discussion here. And with Rodi Alvarado's case, it took, from 1999, it took 10 years of controversy till her case was ultimately granted again. And it took the involvement of 3 successive attorneys general, Janet Reno, John Ashcroft, and Michael Mukasey. Now, some of you who know our legal system know that it's a little bit unusual in an asylum case to have 3 attorneys general, involved in a case. And I think it shows the depth of sort of the significance of this issue, the interest in the issue, and the controversy around this issue. She was, ultimately granted protection, but it wasn't in a precedent decision. And what's also notable is that there were regulations proposed by the Justice Department in 2000, so we're talking 13 years ago, to address cases like Rodi Alvarado's, and those regulations have still not been issued as final. And I, hear that there's a lot of discussion going on in government right now, and it's moving very slowly, partly because of the continuing resistance to granting in these kinds of claims of women. So women are not the only ones that are left out when we talk about how the refugee definition should evolve to recognize other vulnerable populations. Children is another population that's really been left out. In recent years, the number of children, many of them unaccompanied, very young, traveling without parents, have arrived in the U.S. Those numbers have really skyrocketed, and a good number of them come from 3 countries of Central America, which people refer to as the Northern Triangle: El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, where child protection systems are very weak, and organized gangs have preyed upon these youth, threatening them with death if they don't join the gangs. And in addition to fear of the gangs, many of these children are fleeing other forms of abuse of their rights, whether it's incest or, other forms of sexual violence. and in situations where their governments don't protect them. And these cases of children have met the same kind of resistance and denial that characterize the women's cases. And a particularly tragic example is that of Edgar Chochoy, who was a Guatemalan boy who fled to the US to escape the violence of gangs. And he told a judge that if he were returned to Guatemala, the gang members would kill him. And the judge denied, and his prediction came true. 17 days after being sent back, he was gunned down and killed by gang members. So people ask, when you sort of talk about these cases, and I do, put the human face on them. I could be very, dispassionate and not tell the stories of these individuals, but we are talking about human beings whose lives are affected by policies. So when I talk about this, people often ask me, what is this resistance to protecting women and children? Why is this in light of international norms that really would argue towards protection when their governments fail to protect them? And to some degree, and I think we all know this, or you may have thought this yourself as I'm talking, to some degree, it's a fear of floodgates, right? The fear that if we grant to this woman fleeing domestic violence, how many more come? If we grant to this young teenage boy fleeing the gangs, how many more come? And I really very, very strongly feel that fear is misplaced, that countries that have accepted these kinds of claims have not experienced the floodgates. And there's a lot of explanations for that, and if there's time in the question and answer and anybody wants to raise that, I can say a little bit more about why the fear of the floodgates is simply really a myth. So we have this resistance to protection of women and children, and these are cases that I think clearly should come within the refugee definition, that UNHCR or fair interpretation. Beyond those kinds of cases, there are many, many other individuals at terrible risk who actually don't fit within the refugee definition. And I would admit that and concede that. And so, for example, we have people around the world fleeing famine, extreme poverty, situations of illness where in their country they can't obtain the medicine they need, and really it's a death sentence for them to remain. There's, people affected by climate change. And yes, these people are not covered within the current definition, and I'm not arguing that they should be. But, I think it raises a moral and ethical question for us. What should we be doing in the light of this kind of human suffering around the world? I don't think there's any easy solutions. But I do think as human beings that we all have a responsibility to each other that extends beyond borders. The sanctuary movement in the United States, in which people of faith risked arrest to do what they thought was just, is an example of individuals acting out of their sense of conscience and morality. As a nation, we certainly cannot shelter all those fleeing persecution on a global level, but we certainly can do more. Globally, there are around, 42.5 million individuals, 42.5 million, who are refugees, asylum seekers, or internally displaced people. 4 out of 5 of these individuals are hosted in developing countries, which have far less resources than the United States. So you might be wondering, how many refugees does the U.S. admit? Well, if we take a recent fiscal year, let's say 2011, we have a total of about 81,000. We have, through the Overseas Refugee Program, 56,000 that were admitted that year, and through our sort of affirmative and defensive process system within the U.S., we had about another 25,000. And this is in a country where we have a population of 315 million. So I just really, are asking in a way to think, really to raise the moral and ethical question. In light of these numbers, I think the U.S., can and should do more. And at a minimum, it should interpret its refugee definition in a forward-looking manner, which is consistent with human rights norms. This will not only benefit those who seek protection, the Rodi Alvarados or the Edgar Chachoys who risk being sent back to their death, but the U.S., like it or not, is seen as a leader. And when the U.S. adopts a policy that's negative, other countries follow. When the U.S. started interdicting Haitians at sea and sending them back without any opportunity to apply for asylum, it made countries like Australia think there was a green light for doing it. But when the U.S. does something positive, it also has influence. And so I think that the U.S. really showing its commitment to incorporating international human rights norms into its refugee definition would go a long way and send a message that goes beyond our border. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Father Raper.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Karen, and I hope that what you've been saying complements in some ways what I've been prepared to say. I've been asked to talk about forced migration or crisis migration through the lens of one agency with which I've been associated the last 30 years or so, Jesuit Refugee Service. It's an agency which rides on the network of the Jesuits throughout the world. It's present in about 60 countries and has a mission to accompany, to serve, and to defend the rights of refugees. So but the problem is, JRS was founded in 1980 in response to a particular refugee crisis. It was the Vietnamese boat people at the time. And the world's changed a lot, and the refugee realities have changed a lot. So the question I'm putting today is, is this agency still valid? If we were founding this refugee service today, would we found the same organization? So it's not a silly question, really, because we ask not just the same mission, but the same structure, the same strategies. What would we do? For example, in the same area where the Vietnamese boat people were, today the major refugee crisis is the Rohingya boat people, still arriving in the same way. A Muslim minority from Myanmar, from Burma, described as the most persecuted people in the world. They arrived by boat in Thailand, Malaysia, in Bangladesh, by land, sometimes to Bangladesh, and some were so desperate that they recently attempted to make it to Australia by boat. They're intercepted, they're turned back, many die in these perilous journeys. So by comparison with the treatment of the 1980s and all through that period for the Indo-Chinese refugees who were welcomed, 2 million were resettled in other countries, the fate of the Rohingya is appalling. The treatment, indeed the capacity to achieve a peaceful settlement in the Kachin War also, and the treatment of the Rohingya, these are the tests of this new Myanmar regime of Thein Sein, but also they're the test of the international partners, the Western countries, the many investors now enjoying a honeymoon of new investment possibilities in Myanmar. It's a testing time also for the humanitarian agencies, desperate to play a protection role for the 800,000 or 900,000 Rohingyas displaced within their own country, and those pushed back from Bangladesh, Thailand, and Malaysia. We counted it, our JRS team in Cambodia, counted it as a resounding victory when we achieved recently the recognition as refugees of 2 Rohingya, 2 out of about 1.5 million people. So today we face a new world of hostility to refugees, and Karen has spoken to one aspect of that and the need to expand the ways in which refugees are seen. So are the old agencies adequate to the task, and do we need quite new strategies? Well, all humanitarian organizations have a history, they have a story, they have the circumstances in which they were born and in which they work subsequently over the years. They reflect the vision of compassion of their founders, the organizational vision and capacity, the types of resources they're able to call on, and the opportunities of the time. So the Red Cross, for example, was founded in 1859 by Jean-Henri Dunant, and he saw the wounded on the battlefield of Solferino in northern Italy. So he founded an agency recognized now for its strict political neutrality, that all sides would respect, so that their members carrying that big Red Cross, or nowadays Red Crescent also, would be able to attend to the victims without harm to themselves. And they've also worked very hard on developing humanitarian law for engagement, for example, in combat. Karen has spoken a lot about the development of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and its convention, which was set up after the European wars of Second World War, and then definition was extended. International, the agencies, or the development of that now has opened the way for UNHCR to be able to attend to internally displaced people, to stateless persons, to asylum seekers and returnees. But still, as Karen was explaining, it's a tremendous struggle. An agency that's well known to, like Médecins Sans Frontières, was set up after the Biafran Wars, 67 to 70, the War of Secession of Biafra. And its doctors, high-profile people like Bernard Kouchner, were sent there. They went there with Red Cross, the French Red Cross, and found that they had to stand by while civilian victims were simply attacked. But because of the neutrality of Red Cross, they couldn't intervene. So they set up an agency which wouldn't be politically neutral. It would still attend to the humanitarian need of people, whoever they were, but if the need called for it, they would speak or they would intervene. They would blow the whistle about who was doing the killing. So in every humanitarian crisis, there are hundreds of agencies are set up. I saw the other day that Sean Penn, the actor, set up an agency for Haiti, and they've been working there for a solid 6 months. It's alive, it's attractive, and it's attracting big donors at present, and possibly after they finish in Haiti, if they ever finish, they might look to other situations. So JRS is similar. Its first inspiration came from the vision and compassion of our Superior General of the Jesuits at the time, Pedro Arrupe. He was moved by what he saw in 1980 and convinced that the Jesuit order, with its enormous range of institutions, say no more with you here in Boston College, and the capacity of them and persons and network of people, of collaborators, could do something effective. When he made the first call, he just sent out a telegram to provincials. He was absolutely overwhelmed by the response he got, and that gave him an insight that we could institutionalize this somehow, that more could be done. So very soon, that same mission that drew us to Southeast Asia, especially to Thailand, but Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, wherever the boat people were landing, also took us to the conflagrations in the Horn of Africa and to Central America at the time, and new activities of the JRS sprang up really within months at that time. Let me tell you one story, though, of an experience that I had. I was the director of JRS in that early period in Thailand, And we were working in a dozen countries where principally the Indo-Chinese refugees came, but we moved also to Sri Lanka and India with the Tamil people, and then to the Burmese who started coming out. They'd already been coming out since time immemorial, since the wars of the Karen and Kachin had started in the 50s, but they especially came out after the 4/8 revolution, the 8th of August 1988. But we were working in the Thai-Cambodian border. We're a team of about 30 people. And if anyone knows this very bizarre situation, there were 3 sets of camps. In the north were the Royalists, Sihanouk, and in the south were the Khmer Rouge people. And the camps were really controlled by these political forces. And in the center was a remnant of the Lon Nol group, a sort of so-called democratic group. But they were all in an alliance, supported by the West and supported by China. Why? Because they had a common enemy. Vietnam was occupying Cambodia at the time. So it was a very strange situation where 500,000 people were held captive, and we were working in a camp of several 100,000 people, the one in the center, the so-called democratic group, you could say. Nothing democratic about how they were governed at all, and the United Nations had set up a new organization. None of the self-respecting organizations of the UN really wanted to touch it, so they constructed a body called the United Nations Border Relief Organization, and it was composed of UNDP and World Food Programme agencies. We'd been there 10 years, and one of our Jesuit members said, look, this is totally unjust. These people are really imprisoned here for political purposes. They're far too close to the border so that there can be skirmishes by military groups from the camps across the border. We should pull out, blow the whistle on this, do an MSF, if you like, and tell the world what's happening. Our mission is to advocate for the people. So another group said, well, our mission is to accompany and to serve the people. Nobody's dying here exactly, and one day this will be resolved. So while they're here, abandoned by the world, we should accompany them. It was quite a dilemma. I was in charge and I had to make the decision. So fortunately, there was a fellow there, a Jesuit from the United States called Howard Gray. I think he spent some time here on campus, and many of you would know him. He was helping advise us with our reflections and whatever. He said, there's a way to make a decision about this. So we took 6 weeks as a group of 30 people to make a decision. And he said, everybody has to be free about this, the outcome. That was very difficult because very few of us were really free. We all knew what we wanted. But he said, whether you're Christian or not, and some of our members certainly were not, we take half an hour every day to reflect on this. So for 6 weeks this went on, and we came together 3 or 4 times to look at the arguments against, the arguments for, and in the end we came for the final day, full day. We heard all the arguments. People said what they felt, and as I say, there were 30 of us. 15 were for staying and 15 were for going. So Howard said, okay, the process is this. It's now up to you to make the decision. You've spent 6 weeks listening to people, and you've got to make a decision on the basis of this, of what you've heard. So in consultation with Moore, and after a few days of sweating it out, I made a decision that we should stay in the camp, but that we should also work in Cambodia. We should send a group to work in Cambodia. Now, this was actually quite a revolutionary thing. You're either a refugee agency or you're a development agency, especially in those days. Nobody ever did this, to work on both sides of a conflicted border. And our argument was, well, these people will ultimately go back. We'll send a team who know them, who've worked in the camps, who will be there to welcome them and prepare for their return. And actually it became an extraordinary thing because we never realize enough how much, if we're working with a group of people, we take on their own ideological explanation of what they're doing. So when we got our two teams together from inside Cambodia and from the camps, they fought like cats and dogs and then realized that they were not doing an analysis really of the situation. They were, out of great compassion, listening to the people and accepting the people's explanations of why they were there. I could say a lot more about that, but that became a way in which JRS worked in many places. Tanzania, Rwanda, across the border. Our workers in Tanzania refused to go to Rwanda. They said the devil lives there because they'd been hearing the stories from all the people. But when they came together, it was a way in which reconciliation could also be facilitated. So Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia, we worked, Angola, Zambia, in many situations like that, Sudan and Uganda, many situations we insisted to work on both sides of the border. So when we ask the question, should the agency in new circumstances change its mission? No, but it should certainly grow. It should be a learning agency and develop new strategies. So just what are some of the ways in which the world has changed and the refugee realities of the past 30 years have changed? Well, there's been a geographic and continental shift. In the 80s, we dealt with the Asia-Pacific crises, a few others also, but really concentrated in Asia-Pacific. And in the 90s, after the Berlin Wall fell and after the Cold War just evaporated in some ways, there was left behind, like in Somalia, countries awash with weapons, and or Liberia, where normally the US would have intervened. It had its CIA stationed there for Africa. It had its tracking stations. What were they called? That whole satellite tracking system. It had one of the biggest embassies. It had warships off the coast. They did nothing because the Cold War was over, and Liberia suffered for the next 10 or 15 years of constant upheaval. So the world changed quite a lot, and the conflicts were more about resources, about race, about territory, and about local issues. A bit like what could now happen in Myanmar when the dictatorships lifted, the local conflicts emerge, as what happened in Yugoslavia. When the dictatorship lifted, local conflicts came out and flourished. Another shift, you could say, now into the current period is that we're really in a Middle East crisis, as well as Central Asia, the Sahel, Northern Africa. And for JRS, I know now the focus is shifting from Africa to the Middle East. If there are plans for Syria, they're one of the few agencies very active within Syria. If their plans follow through, perhaps a third of their activity will really be in Syria. JRS continues to respond to crises and keeps its original dynamic in that way. As with the crisis shift now to the Middle East, we realize that today perhaps 70% of refugees are Muslim, particularly if we include the Palestinians, but also the Afghans and North African displaced people. From Syria now, 8,000 people leave every night. There are 2 million in refugee camps, but interesting developments. Lebanon, for example, has no camps. Lebanon houses all its several thousand refugees in houses. They've opened their houses, they've built extra houses, they've put another level on. You know how a lot of Middle Eastern houses have the top floor as yet unbuilt. They've built those up. So they've welcomed all into houses. Another change is the urbanization of forced migration. At least half of today's displaced people, forcibly displaced people, struggle to survive in urban areas, which brings specific protection problems, unemployment and sheer poverty, of course, but also xenophobia, exploitation, and not infrequently incarceration and deportation. So many obstacles in the cities prevent their access to basic services that are more readily available in camps, like food, like health, like education, like psychosocial services. The big challenge today, too, is the mixed flows, that people arrive through the same smugglers or the same routes from the same countries and come to the same places and seek asylum and entry into the same countries, but they come for a great variety of reasons: political repression, ethnic conflict, environmental disaster, poverty, and famine. There's an increasingly hazy blur between migrants and refugees, and much, much more difficult to differentiate between who move as refugees and who move for other reasons. But hunger kills just as war does. Recently, I was reading an interview with a young woman, HIV positive, victim of trafficking from Nigeria, being helped by JRS. Not a refugee. Unfortunately, we're not restricted, JRS is not restricted by the international definition of who we help. But nonetheless, we're certainly open to help people who are not necessarily convention refugees. So the reasons for flight have changed. In those early days, I spoke of the ideological conflicts, fleeing communism, and conflicts in which sides, nation states took sides, if you like. But today, people are leaving home for a tremendous range of reasons, including some of those reasons that Karen has referred to. And the other big feature today, and I feel this especially in my own country, Australia, is the increasing hostility of especially Western governments, and often communities too. And so the appeal for politicians to be re-elected is appealing to this. It's very much a feature of the global refugee phenomenon. Another feature is the mandatory detention for irregular arrivals, and I think Karen would like to speak to that, and I would happily speak to that as well, that detention is a horrific feature of supposedly a deterrent, but there's absolutely no proof that it is a deterrent in any case. That leads only to the dehumanization of the detainees. The number of stateless persons, when I started work in the early 80s, we never expected to meet a stateless person. I think there's possibly 3 or 4 million stateless people in Thailand now. Similar numbers in Malaysia. There's 12 million stateless people throughout the world today. Unfortunately, that convention is getting stronger, getting more adherents, and the UNHCR has the opportunity to work with them. And similarly, internally displaced persons. It's a concept that was really only developed in the late 80s and by Francis Deng. And in those days, we didn't even know the words, if you like. We knew the people. But today, we're talking of some 27 million people. So in conclusion, what is needed today in, and I'm referring specifically to the experience of an agency like Jesuit Refugee Service. a small player in an enormous global challenge? Well, I feel that our mandate of accompaniment, service, and defense of the rights of the people, it's a mission statement to die for, you could say, because it brings in a whole range of capacity. But accompaniment and service are needed, certainly. But today, perhaps more than ever, the advocacy is needed, whether it's through the quiet statement of a team going in to work in a country like Cambodia, which was not easy to enter, or through a voice in Washington or Brussels. But all rely on the credibility of the people in the field. They all rely on the face-to-face contact with the refugees. They all really are much stronger when it's the voice of the refugees which is heard. One field of advocacy, and I feel Karen's spoken to this very strongly, is with the UN itself, of enabling its mandate to be widened, to deal with disasters, to deal with mixed flows, but also through individual cases, landmark cases, as well as through enabling the application of the mandate to be widened. JRS has a strong legal arm, and similarly, as has been referred to in the last talk, the development of soft law is important. In my part of the world, we only have 2 or 3 countries that have recognized the UN definition or convention, but the others have not and will not. But they have signed on to the rights of the child, the rights of women, various human rights conventions. And within those conventions are elements which ensure the protection of people. So a soft law approach, you could say, of putting together, and that's the work of your legal departments or whatever, extends, in fact, the protection capacity. And after all, that's what we're on about. Also, NGOs like JRS, I feel, have a contribution to make through innovation, through trying things on a small scale, a bottom-up breakthroughs, giving employment to refugees, enabling refugees to help refugees, giving refugees a platform to advocate their own agenda. The urban refugee crisis gives us quite new challenges, and I'm very happy that the Boston College School of Social Work, for example, has been sending people, experts, into the field. We have in our Johannesburg office, we have someone from Boston who's helping with techniques, with methodology, with administration, as a backup for the people who are in the field. So education also remains a hallmark of the work of JRS and has immense multiplier consequences. If you're in a camp of 1,000 people, 500 are children. And if you look after the children, you're also looking after the care of the concern of the parents. So education is about the future. And a future, if you're focusing on future, you're focusing on hope. So in the end, my conclusion is that the mission of JRS, its Ignatian tenets and methodologies, like that decision-making approach we had, which underlie it as a faith-based organization, contain many elements that help us to respond to some of today's forced migration challenges: accompaniment, being present among forgotten refugees, going where the need's greatest, the focus on education, bringing hope into seemingly hopeless situations, presence, which is a protection, networking with other partners, many other partners, especially the local church. So we reinforce the local church so that it can respond quickly, as we did in the case of Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, and gain trust so that the service can remain when we're moving on somewhere else. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Karen and to Mark for those two wonderful, inspiring talks. And my role here is to be is to respond, and I'm going to be very brief because I want to give us an opportunity to have a conversation as a group. But I thought what I would do is maybe comment on a few things that were said and maybe raise a few questions that might help to stimulate our conversation and get us thinking. Obviously, there's a lot here to think about and a lot to do, but I think that these two talks have given us a wonderful place to begin to think about these questions. I thought I would start first by just commenting on some things that Karen laid out for us. She helped to really frame the international legal regime, both historically and structurally. And I think that told us an important story about this fertile post-World War II era of international agreements, the era that produced the Refugee Convention and the Refugee Protocol. But they are both, for all that they offer us, they're both products of a different time in many ways. And she laid that out in more detail by talking a little bit about how they really emphasized the needs that people have as a matter of protecting their civil and political rights and framing the world in that way, where they're a world of nation states that are really the actors, and social and political rights really being the things that need to be defended and if you're going to protect individuals. But the world has moved beyond that, and we're looking actually much more closely at social and economic rights. And as we start to see rights as becoming more comprehensive, new types of problems evolve, and we don't necessarily have the structures to deal with them. And one of the interesting things that comes to me when we think about that is this country, the United States, is a country that actually has long resisted this broader notion of rights. And so even for all the good that we do in this area, we are in a sense part of the problem, this kind of tension that exists in the legal system as to what rights really are about and whether or not we're really willing to say that, yes, actually we have these other responsibilities that come out of this other reference point of social and economic rights. The other thing I thought was worth mentioning, well, and this leads us to some of the shortcomings that she identified in the system of how we protect refugees and asylum seekers, and the two very glaring examples of women and children. So here we have increasingly individuals who are clearly suffering, and we see the legal system just struggling to figure out ways to help them, and we start to see that resistance actually in play. So a broad question that I think comes out of all of this is, why do claims for refugee status by women based on gender-based issues remain controversial? Why the resistance to the needs and claims of children? How are we going to understand in the future who is in need? The big question of the who here I think is really important. Who is in need and how do we help them? What's going on in the world more broadly that demands our attention? So the other question I wanted to pose here is, as we are thinking about rights in new ways and as these questions are expanding, are there other things that we should be looking at worldwide? What other types of things are happening that demand our attention as well? And I think to some extent Mark addressed those questions or raised those questions for us, and I'll comment on those again briefly in a moment. So the other point I wanted to bring out about this is when we think about the number of people who are refugees and the number we actually accept in the United States, I thought it was fascinating how small that number was. 81,000, I think is what you said. 81,000 people out of a global refugee problem of 42.5 million people. Here we are in the richest nation on the planet, probably, a nation of 315 million people. So 81,000 is a minuscule number in the population. So I thought, well, obviously we can think about it more broadly. Perhaps we want to connect that number to the broader problem of undocumented migrants, because it seems to me that a lot of the people who could be identified as refugees and asylum seekers may be part of that number of the undocumented, because obviously their claims will never be heard or they will never be able to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the legal system that they deserve to be counted amongst the asylum seekers and refugees. So we have this broader problem of undocumented people that maybe masks a lot of the issues that we're discussing today. But even if we look at that number, 11 million, 12 million, we're still in the United States talking about less than 4% of the population. So again, I raise the question, what are our responsibilities as a nation in the face of a problem of this magnitude, in terms of perhaps absorbing some of these people into a large country, a wealthy country, and a country that obviously has some capacity. We could argue for many, many hours about what capacity, but some capacity for doing more. From there, I wanted to turn briefly to Mark's comments, and I just thought it was fascinating to see, to hear, from him about an area of the world that for many of us remains still, somewhat unknown. I mean, to talk about groups like the Rohingya, which are suffering, dramatically, but to say honestly, I had to say to myself, I hear rarely ever about these people in our media, and I consider myself a fairly well-informed person, but it's a problem that I didn't know very much about. And I think it's really important to hear about these areas of the world where similar problems are occurring, but then the specifics of those problems, the specifics of those local conflicts actually help to deepen and enrich our understanding of how we might try to address the broader problem, the global problem, because we see repeatedly around the world over time, it's almost like a wave around the world that comes up in different places around similar types of issues. And new issues like climate change, issues like famine, that famine endures, but climate change is something that's producing new questions for us to deal with, and also producing migration and refugees. So I thought I would conclude by just mentioning or connecting us back briefly to Richard Rodriguez's excuse me, Richard, I'm sorry, Rodriguez's talk from last night. And thinking a little bit about some of the issues he raised. When Mark was speaking about the beginnings of the JRS and the connection to the Vietnamese boat people, I was reminded forcibly of my own experience as a child in an area where we welcomed many of those refugees to our town, and seeing the kind of vacant faces of young children in my junior high school who were suddenly thrust from often a very privileged life in Vietnam to the sort of rough and tumble of a suburban high school in the United States, and just their struggles to come to terms with who they'd been, who they are now, and who they might ultimately become. And I thought a little bit about the questions around stability and identity. When we are thinking about the growing resistance to the claims of refugees and migrants that Mark mentioned, I thought, well, of course, to have an us, we really do have to have a them. But how we define that us and them in the context of global migration and refugee crises and such, may no longer, the way we've done it in the past, the way we've looked at ourselves may no longer be up to the task of dealing with the kinds of things we have to deal with in the world going forward. Now, a lot of this mobility clearly cries out for a response in justice, and the question remains for us as to how we are going to deal with that. In my own work, I look at some of the results of this migration, and when Mark raised some of the new questions and problems that we'll be facing in the years ahead, I thought of what I face when I deal with migrants and refugees in London. People who are thrust into new urban environments, many of them, a large percentage of them are Muslim. The reasons for their arrival in London have changed. It's not simply people who are coming for economic reasons, although that's still part of it. They're coming for all kinds of reasons, many of which Mark mentioned. They're thrusting that city into a sort of new kind of conflict over what the future will be. What kind of city is London going to be? What kind of country is England going to be? What does it mean to be British? So this movement and this need to deal with our brothers and sisters around the world who are in crisis is going to change us, and it's already beginning to do so. So there will be much demanded of us in the future if we're going to take this issue seriously. And I know that many of us hope that we will. So we need advocacy. I also think we need service. I think there will be a call for all of us to think about how we individually and how our institutions are going to step up and address the problem in a meaningful way. It's not going to go away. It's only going to become more serious. And we know that our institutions, our legal institutions and others, are not really in a good position to deal with it. We have the beginnings of some answers that have been presented to us, so I'd like to open it up for questions to hear what you all think. Thank you so much. So I'm going to return to my seat, but I'll lead questions, and you can address them to either one or both of our panelists. Dan.
So Karen speaks eloquently and movingly about ways to interpret the Refugee Convention in an evolving way. And Mark and Vince, I think you to some extent implicitly raised the question of whether this is, at this point, an anachronistic hindrance to more creative thinking. And I wonder if both Karen and Mark could, and Vince if you want to, expand on this a little bit and help us think about whether we should be trying harder to maybe transcend the refugee concept entirely and think more functionally about these new problems. When we talk about should we revisit this, there's a realpolitik here, which is nation states are very unlikely to agree to anything close to being as protective as the 51 Convention if we reopened that can of worms. On the other hand, it seems to me we spend an enormous amount of time trying to work on this evolving definition and fit square pegs into somewhat roundish holes, not to, you know how much I support the enterprise, but it is a struggle to expand interpretation all the time, versus rethinking the problems of how migrants, forced or otherwise, suffer around the world and face harm due to deportation, and maybe come up with more functional ideas of discretionary protection and so forth. So I'll just open that up to you too, and wonder what you think about bigger ways of thinking about it now.
I'd be the first one to agree with everything that Dan said. That it's not really a time politically to try to open the definition to include all the categories of people, and I do think we need a more creative solution. And I think something Mark said really resonated with thoughts I've had about this, which is when Mark was talking about the experience of working both with the refugees and in the home country. Because I think we can't talk about migration without talking about the root causes. There are reasons why people move. And I think to the degree that people are, I don't want to use an indelicate term, but to the degree that people are anti-immigrant, no country's ever going to build like walls, high enough to keep people out. And the only way to really, I think, address migration is to address the root causes, and this is going to sound like hopelessly naive and idealistic, but I think that we have to address issues of human rights and social justice and distribution of wealth. And I think that unless and until we do that, thank you. So there are other naive, hopeless idealists in the room. But I think until we do that, we won't address the problem. And then I think secondarily what Dan said is we do need other forms of protection in Europe, in the European directives. There's, forms of protection that are sort of broader humanitarian, for a broader range of humanitarian reasons and not just the people who meet the traditional definition. So I don't want to go on at too much length, but I totally agree with Dan's point.
Just to agree with both of you, but to add, we have a regional definition for Latin America. We have a regional definition for Africa. And this is very helpful because they face local situations. Think that and we don't have a regional approach in Asia, and we really, really miss it. We can't get them to the states to work together. But what UNHCR has done is 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but it still keeps going. And I would hate to see what we've got dismantled because, for example, there is now a convention on internally displaced people. They are entrusted with that. It is a very significant advance, you could say. And similarly in the area of stateless persons, which is a contemporary problem. So at least they're there, keeping watch over the back door, but it's the front door where we also have to work. And I think two approaches. One is that possibility to get regional agreements, which we desperately need in Asia, and the possibility to use the soft law approach, to use the other conventions and take the elements from that which really apply, so that in local jurisprudence these are built in and applied.
This is a question for both of you. From what sources do you get your operating funds for your organizations, and is that a difficult thing to get money? Do you have adequate funds?
I love pragmatic and direct questions. I'm based at a university, but the center that I direct that does the gender and the children's work and the LGBT work is not funded by the university. So it's really from all the usual suspects. We get foundation money, law firm support, individual donors. And I will say, like anybody who's in a nonprofit, it has not gotten easier with all the economic downturn. So it's a challenge, but it's a challenge whose rewards on a personal level are well worth it.
Yeah, well, I think that the operating budget of the JRS is about $20 or $30 million, 20 or 30 million euros at present, and it's principally from private donations and agencies, especially Catholic agencies. But that's become problematic because the Catholic agencies in Europe don't have as much money as they used to have. They've more recently taken some counterpart funding from governments, but it's usually counterpart. So a Catholic agency puts up a certain amount and a European Union puts up a certain amount else. Then they've become operating agency for the UN at times, which has its advantages because you get a lot of doors opened for access to a particular population, but it has disadvantages because that's year by year decisions. So for long-term programs, we really have to have multilateral sources. But the Jesuit network, I'd say, is our primary source, if you like, of the support that comes through the support in kind, the support of volunteers, the capacity to set up an office locally without very little cost, if you like, because there's already a community in place, makes it a very cost-efficient organization.
The call for service and for advocacy simultaneously sounds wonderful. And I would like to call you all here present for advocacy for migrants right here in Massachusetts. Our elected officials, not just in Washington, but right here in Massachusetts, are participating in the creation of a human rights crisis right here. Nationwide, there's 2,000 to 3,000 children every week that lose a parent to immigration detention or deportation. The Obama administration has ratcheted up these family destructions to levels unknown under the Bush administration, and the state of Massachusetts is not at all a progressive, anti-racist haven. To the contrary. So I would like to ask you to inform yourselves what is going on right here. I take care of families and of children to whom this is happening right now as we speak. And you can inform yourselves about bills introduced into the legislature to mitigate these effects on families. One is called the Trust Act, introduced by Senator Baldridge of Acton, and it would mitigate the so-called Secure Communities Program, which is a prime program of funneling undocumented people into detention and deportation. And detention here in the United States is a corporate business by private companies to a large extent, involving abuse and rape. And this happens to the parents of my patients. And number two, the driver's license bill, and now I'm blanking on the name of the representative who introduced that. The reason these bills are not moving forward in the legislature is because Massachusetts politicians believe it will help their election prospects more if they take anti-immigrant stances than if they support the people who clean our floors, take care of our old people, prepare our food in the restaurants, roof our houses, and often suffer horrific accidents because their safety is not protected, etc. I could go on, but you can do something. You can inform yourself, and you can call your senator, state senator, and representative about these bills.
Thank you. I want to make sure we get to some other questions. Thank you so much. I think there was another question right over here. I think we'll let them bring you a microphone so we can.
I've really appreciated the conversation about the evolution that's needed around policy in this sphere. But I also heard a thread in your comments that had more to do with our philosophy or our attitudes around issues of responsibility, identity, belonging, this notion of accompaniment. And I wonder how you see the sort of levers that might shift not just our legal tools, but the philosophies and the attitudes behind them for the broader population.
Well, responding to both those speakers, we do have a problem with regard to politicians who want to get re-elected. But speaking to power, it's probably most effective, not just good arguments, but of personal appeal. I know we helped to launch the campaign against landmines, for example, and our main protagonists were two people from Cambodia. One, Song Kosal, little girl who lost one leg through a landmine accident, and the other was Tun Chanaret, a man who lost two legs as a fighter. And normally we would have those people, those two, especially the little girl with a crutch and just one leg, come to meetings of states parties to this matter, and it was immensely powerful. I think basically the principle is that if we want to help people really understand the effect of these policies, the refugees, the people affected, have to be helped to come right into the fora where decisions are made.
Good morning. I'm Peter Scarry. I teach political science here at Boston College. I wanted to ask the panelists, given the kinds of constraints and resistance to refugee admissions that you have, especially Professor Musillo, so eloquently laid out for us, I'm wondering, any survey evidence I've looked at has always pretty clearly indicated that however great the resistance toward refugees in Western democracies, including the United States, that resistance is lower than the resistance toward immigrants generally. But basically, however you read that evidence, there are obviously political constraints at work here in terms of the ability of Western societies and publics to absorb numbers of newcomers. I would like you to address, if you would, the extent to which there have to be difficult choices here between the needs of the kinds of individuals whose plights you've described and the needs of more typically situated, struggling, economically marginal or ambitious immigrants. We have to make choices. This can't be simply a continuing politics of addition. Clearly, in this era, I don't think it can be, in this political environment. So I would ask you to reflect upon how we make the difficult choices between the plights of the individuals you have talked about and the arguably less pressing difficulties of more typical migrants.
I actually don't see it as a zero-sum game where we have to choose one over the other. The U.S. is a wealthy country by any standard, and I don't think that the arguments that that extending protection to both refugees and immigrants is somehow damaging one or the other or the U.S. population really hold out with the studies that show how much of a contribution these individuals make. So I guess I'm just not sure that the underlying premise is something I agree with, and I totally respect your opinion on that. But I don't think it's necessarily true, and I think that when we cast things that way, we really end up dehumanizing one or the other and saying one group of people is more worthy than another. And I think the place that I come from, just honestly, morally, ethically, is like the right of every human being to fulfill their potential. And I'm not going to kind of privilege one over another. And that's just my very personal, sort of honest response.
Yeah, when you put a question like that, about a critical choice that we face, I wonder who that we is. Because the issue is what is the choice of the refugee, and generally, no one wants to leave home if we're talking about refugees. They've left forcibly. That's what we say. Now, some people do want to leave. They want to go as migrants or whatever, but generally speaking, people would much rather stay at home. So the whole brunt of our effort has to be to enable that, to have a world where people can be at home in their own place. But we have some very difficult situations, both the crises of sudden onset crises, but we have these protracted situations. In Dadaab camp in Kenya, people are in the third generation now of refugee life. There are 6 million people in protracted refugee situations, and I think that the average age for those protracted camps is 17 years. So the thing is how to solve that. Well, we're not going to get those 6 million people into the United States, but there has to be a political settlement, and I would think that that requires much greater energy and diplomacy in thinking ahead about these situations so that people aren't forced to leave home. That's, I suppose that's the basic premise. The difficult question about whether they can get into the United States is a solution for a minority, but the fundamental global solution is that people can stay at home peacefully in their own place.
Question, David?
My question is really somewhat theoretical, I guess, but how to think about the expansion of our vision of who we feel an obligation to admit. it occurred to me that thinking about not just the Refugee Convention and stretching it or expanding it, but to start from a different direction, that with the development of the doctrine of the responsibility to protect coming out of the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide and the crisis in Srebrenica in Bosnia, and developing into something affirmed by the United Nations General Assembly at the World Summit, saying that the responsibility to protect people against really grave human rights violations rests with their own country. But if their own country fails to protect them from these really grave human rights violations like genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, that the international community has a responsibility to try to come to their assistance. That's a sort of movement from outside into a country, to intervene in a country. Would it be feasible to turn that around and to say we have a responsibility to protect by admitting people whose really grave human rights or face really grave human rights violations? Now, we've already got refugees under that. Persecution is counting as a grave human rights violation. I'm wondering whether there is a way to say really grave human rights violations like severe gender-based torture or possibly a violation of fundamental rights of children or extraordinary crisis like famine, that in these situations there is a responsibility to admit that could be broadened under the R2P doctrine rather than under the Refugee Convention. It's basically the same effect that I'm looking for, but I'm trying to think, is there a strategic way to think about this in a way that would move in a new direction?
I think that in a way what you're getting at is a little bit where sort of the two bookends of Dan's first comment when he was saying something like a subsidiary protection, because I think it does need to get, I do think it does need to, there is a need to come at this from a different way other than trying to get the refugee definition to stretch beyond what it can. But just to underscore, I think some of the cases that we're talking about, like women, children, other populations, I actually think under a fair, unbiased interpretation of the Refugee Convention, those individuals fit. But people caught in the sort of crossfire is sort of the paradigmatic, no, they don't fit, they're not targeted. And I think you're getting at some of those situations where what you've described sounds like a really innovative theoretical approach that takes something that exists and turns it around a little bit to actually provide a basis for providing sanctuary. It sounds really like an interesting way of coming at it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm glad that you raised the issue of Burma, because as a person coming from a Muslim country, Kurdistan, Turkey, it's so interesting that it was not really heard here. I was really surprised. And the same is true for Muslim countries where Rwanda genocide or Congo is not discussed that much. I wonder, like, our discourse of human rights is very religiously based or ethnically based, how we can really objectify and like also, instead of coming to these conflicts, how we can increase peace-building activities in order to prevent all of these violations in the world. Thank you.
I don't know if it's our discourse that's so much affected by religious questions, but some ways I wonder if it's no accident that 70% of refugees today are Muslim, and that the sympathy or the readiness to respond or the typecasting of Muslim people as making trouble or occurs really quite consistently, I suppose, and also the capacity to relate with Muslim people, probably among a whole range of agencies, is limited. I think there's very likely something there. But in the case of, we have a very depressing situation in Myanmar at present, where it's become, it's a racial question, but it's become a religious question, because the predominant religion is Buddhism, but quite contrary to the tenets of Buddhism of compassion, of karuna, metta, the predominant attitude of the majority population towards this minority is inflammatory, and that's creating tremendous problems. Like every day on the front page of the papers in Jakarta is the Rohingya question. Why? Because this is an oppressed group of Muslims, and I think that Burma is running tremendous risks in not treating these people with justice, because it inflames the whole religious question as an international issue too. So if it arouses Saudi and others to respond in sympathy with these people, it could be a horrific situation. So I think religion plays a tremendous part, and really in terms of its religious identity rather than religion as a faith, if you like. But fundamentally, this is an issue of race, of territory, and of human rights, not fundamentally a religious issue, but religion is, like so many times through history, has the opportunity of just throwing petrol onto the flame.
Well, I'd like to thank both of our panelists for a very stimulating conversation. Thank you.